Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I'm Francesca Civilotti, and I'm here with Michael Poirier, a fellow teacher and tutor at lsatdemon.com. Michael, how are you doing?
Doing great, Francesca. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So we're giving Nathan a bit of a break this morning because we got a listener email from listener Brandon that is all about Canadian law schools. And this is right up our alley because, as you might know, Michael and I are the only Canadians on the LSAT Demon team. So Michael, why don't you tell the listeners where you're from, where you are now, and maybe how cold it is where you are.
Okay, yeah. I'm from Mississauga, Ontario, and I'm currently living in Ottawa, working for the government here. Ottawa is quite cold. It's not too bad today. Right now, it's about like minus 10-ish. If there are any American listeners, that's in Celsius, not in Fahrenheit.
I think that's like minus, or I think that's 14 degrees Fahrenheit.
Maybe great math. I have no idea, but it's not warm for sure.
Yeah. No, I did not know that off the top of my head. I was going to say because so I'm in Halifax right now, and yesterday was minus 10. So I looked up what that would be in Fahrenheit. Anticipating this. I can't do that conversion method.
Yeah, I was about to say that was really impressive.
No. I'm planning on going to law school, not medicine or math and physics.
Yeah.
Yeah. So myself, I'm from Kingston, Ontario, and I'm currently in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And yeah, yesterday it was minus 10. Today it is 10 degrees. It looks like we've got a bit of a heat wave situation going on right now. So I don't mind that.
I'm so jealous.
Yeah. So Halifax is on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. All right. So should we jump into this email?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a message here from Brandon. Brandon says, I listened to the Demon Daily episode today about Canadian law schools. I think there are a number of factors at play to prevent the cost issue that U.S. schools face. One, Canadian universities are publicly funded by the respective province that they are located in.
Maybe we can just pause after every point. So what are your thoughts about that first point?
I don't have any issue with that. That's 100% correct. That does play a factor in why our law schools are cheaper in Canada.
Yeah, I agree.
Point two, there are only 24 law schools in all of Canada. This creates an extremely competitive environment, which allows the school to have their pick of competitive candidates. What do you think about that, Francesca?
Yeah, so this is where I start to agree a little bit less with what Brandon is saying. So yes, there are far fewer law schools in Canada than in the States. But if you look at the populations, the actual number of schools per person and presumably per applicant is not that different. So in the US, there are 330 million people roughly, and there are about just over 200 ABA accredited law schools. So if you're looking at just the population, not the applicants specifically, because that would take way too much time, but per person, that's about like 0.62 law schools per person. Whereas in Canada, we have 24 law schools, but we have a population of 38 million. So that's 0.63 law schools per person. So that is basically the same number.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think what you're getting at, Francesca, is that the supply of law schools might be lesser, but the demand is also lesser. I don't know the exact number of applications there are in total in Canada versus the United States. I would imagine they're fairly similar. I did some super intense research on this beforehand, and by that I mean I Googled it for 10 seconds. There are 130,000 lawyers in Canada and 1.3 million in the United States. So that's pretty much exactly 10 times more lawyers in the US than there are here. However, you can do the math on this. With only 24 law schools in Canada versus 200 in the United States, that actually means there are more law schools per lawyer in Canada than there are in the United States. I'm not 100% sure what that says, but I do think that makes an argument for there being more options available in Canada per lawyer or per person than there are in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's just getting at, I guess what we're saying, Brandon, is that it just is not necessarily true that there's a more competitive pool or that there are fewer schools in Canada and that they can pick the only the best. That's not necessarily true. And then we'll also talk about this in terms of your third point here, which Michael generated for us.
Yeah, sure. Brandon's third point is the schools are not ranked in the same way US schools are. Sure, everyone knows which schools are the best, but for the most part, any school you go to gets you an equal JD. Unless you're looking at Big Law in Toronto, they're more likely picky and expect a U of T degree. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that what Brandon's trying to get at here is the idea that the perceived importance of rankings is greater in the United States, and that a degree, so to be clear, every school in the US, every law school, ABA accredited, is going to give you a JD, and all those degrees are of equal value on their face. But I think that what Brandon's getting at is the fact that your job prospects might vary pretty wildly if you've got a degree from Yale versus a degree from the school ranked, I don't know, 80th or 90th on the list. I kind of agree with this. I would say that in Canada, the rankings, I mean, maybe like downtown Toronto, a degree from U of T might matter a little bit more, but I don't like the rankings in Canada, I would not say are going to substantially impact your job prospects. But I would say that also in the US, it's not that the rankings don't matter at all and that there's not going to make any difference. But like Ben and Nathan say, like there's like the 100% rule, that if there's not 100% difference, yeah, in the rankings of the school, then it's just not a substantial difference. Like going to the school ranked number 6 is not that different from going to the school ranked 10th, you know? What do you think about that?
So I think there is a grain of truth to what Brandon's saying here, but I also don't quite agree at the same time. So we might not have a U.S. News World Report, but we do have a Maclean's report that does rank these law schools. There tends to be a fairly strong consensus in the top 3, similar to how it is in the United States with HYS schools. Here it tends to be U of T number 1, pretty much universally, the same way Yale is universally number 1. 2 and 3 is kind of a toss-up between UBC and McGill generally. And then for the most part, there are a ton of schools there in the middle of the pack. They're all very fine schools that you'll get a great education at, talking like your Queens, your Westerns, your Dalhousie's, your Calgary's, UVics. These are all very good schools that you get a good degree at, but the employment outcomes are still slightly different than they are for the universal top 3 between McGill, UBC, and Toronto. You still have a better chance. Through sorry, I forgot to mention Osgoode as well. You have a better chance of becoming a judge, of working on the Supreme Court, of working anywhere across Canada if you go to one of the more acclaimed, I suppose, law schools in Canada than if you were to go to, again, this isn't to dump on any particular school, let's say, I don't know, Thompson Rivers or my alma mater, Lakehead or Moncton. It'll be significantly harder to work in Canada's quote unquote big law if you go to one of those schools than if you go to University of Toronto, let's say.
Yeah, totally. So maybe for those like top jobs, it might make a bit of a difference, or it probably will make a difference. But this also goes back to what we were talking about in the most recent newsletter blog post that came out about Canadian law schools. You can find more information on this. It's on the lsatdemon.com website. And at the end of the day, the most important thing to keep in mind is that for the vast majority of people who want to be lawyers and people who are going to end up practicing law, it's more important that you go to school where you want to practice and that you start building your network there, and that, you know, you I don't know, get to know the city, like have a lifestyle that works with you, than getting caught up in rankings that at the end of the day just don't matter as much as you think they do, as much as people talk about them like they do. Yeah, just don't get too caught up in that, I would say.
Right. If you, unless you want to work specifically on Bay Street or one day work on the Supreme Court, location should absolutely be your number 1 determinant of where you're going to law school, especially in Canada, probably to the same degree in the States.
Do we want to look at the last point?
Yeah, let's check out this last point. 4, lastly, the schools don't have to report their LSAT and GPA stats. Some schools have 0 data posted, which allows them to look at applicants from a holistic perspective. And many of the schools pride themselves in this. It is, in all caps, much harder to get into law school in Canada. Wow. Okay, I have a lot to say about this, but I'll defer to you for a second.
Yeah, I'm sure that you're going to say much about this, or say more about this, but except for that last sentence, okay, I fully disagree with the notion that it is much harder to get into law school in Canada. But everything else in that point, about how the fact that the schools don't report their stats, it's not like we don't have the equivalent of an ABA 509 report that you can find on US schools. I think that this does lead to a more holistic review process, and it does give schools more leeway to set their own weighting schemes and application, the amount of weight that they assign to each component of your application. It lets them pay more attention to factors like who you actually are and what you've done with your undergrad, with your work experience, just with your life, as opposed to focusing solely on numbers, because in the US those will like determine your US World News rankings, and that leads to the whole mess that's going on in the States. But we don't really have that in Canada. I think that's a great thing, but does it make it much harder to get into Canada? No. Please say more about that.
No, I would in fact say quite the opposite, Brandon. When there are only a few, for the most part, every school in Canada does report their LSAT and GPA stats. There are only a select few that don't. Off the top of my head, I'm going to say Windsor, University of Moncton, I think Thompson Rivers. There could be a couple others in there. Maybe Ryerson is a new law school. The fact that they don't report LSAT and GPA numbers doesn't make them harder to get in. It actually is the opposite. It's actually slightly easier to get in. And that might sound controversial. The truth is, if you submit an application that could get you into Canada's consensus #1, U of T, make no mistake, you are also getting into Windsor. You are also getting into Ryerson, Thompson Rivers, and Moncton. The fact they don't post the LSAT and GPA stats is kind of a way of allowing students who didn't perform as well. And I want to clarify, that doesn't mean that they are not as qualified. I just mean that they didn't objectively do as well in terms of hard numbers into the school. I don't want you getting the impression that this means that they have some ridiculous qualifications that wouldn't have allowed them to get into U of T or into a top 10 school in the States, but would only allow them to get into, let's say, Windsor. Not the case. If you do well in the LSAT and the GPA and your GPA, and otherwise put together an application that would have got you into the top schools, you are also getting into these schools. Just wanted to get that out of the way first. Now, the second part of this that I have a very major issue with is this last part where Brandon says it is much harder to get into law school in Canada. This is not true. Okay, that's as bluntly as I can put it. That is not true. That does not mean, and again, I'll clarify, that doesn't mean that the quality of our education, for the most part, isn't better. I think, on average, our law schools are better quality, I would say, than the United States, until you get to the top end of US law schools. Once you get to about the top 6, we're talking HYS, we're talking NYU, Columbia, Chicago, that's kind of where we don't really have a school that can compete. The University of Toronto, and British Columbia, McGill, so on, as well regarded internationally as they are, they don't quite have that prestige that those schools have. Now, in terms of it being harder, I'm going to give you some anecdotal evidence here from my own experience applying in the United States and in Canada. And this isn't to brag or to complain about results. It is just to paint a picture of the difference in difficulty in applying in Canada versus the States. So my first LSAT score was a 169, and I had a 4.0 GPA. That was what I applied with last year to Canadian law schools. With those numbers, a 169 and a 4.0, I got into every school that I applied to. U of T, Osgoode, Queen's, Dalhousie, UBC, I think somewhere else. Later on in that cycle, I upped my score to a 177. I applied with that school. And this is why we say at the Demon not to apply at the deadline, always apply in September. I applied with the same application, but with a significantly better score. There's a huge difference between a 169 and a 177. There's no question about that. It's a completely different ballpark. With a better score, and the exact same application in the US, do you want to take a guess at how many top 10 offers I received? This is not, again, this is not to complain at all. This is just to say what happened. Take a guess.
5.
The answer is 0. 0 top 10 law schools. I was either waitlisted or rejected at every top 10 law school with those numbers. That is just, again, not a complaint at all whatsoever. There are probably things that I could have done much better. I put as much effort into my resume and my personal statement as I could have at the time, but that is just to show the level of difficulty right now, especially right now, when we're talking about COVID-19 pandemic level competitiveness, these 2 years being the most competitive years in law school ever. It is so unfathomably, absurdly difficult in the top 10 law schools in the United States right now, where even insanely strong numbers aren't enough, where even if you have the perfect application, it still might not be enough. It is so hard. And I'm not saying my application was perfect. There are definitely aspects that could have been improved. There always are aspects that can be improved. That's just
well, probably the timing. I'm excited to see what your results are going to be like when you're applying, like the early in the cycle. And
hopefully, again, I put as much effort into it as I could have, and that's not to complain at all. I want to reiterate that time and time again. It's just to say how much harder it is. It truly is. The competitiveness, again, competitiveness doesn't equal quality of education. The competitiveness right now between the top 10 in the US and the Canadian law schools is like comparing the NBA to junior varsity in high school. It is so not the same. It is so there's such a massive disparity. Virtually every top 20 school in the United States has a 170 median 170 median LSAT. Our best school in Canada, U of T, only has a 168. You have to go down to about the 25th ranked school in the US to get down to a 168. If anything, I'm telling our American students in our classes, why aren't you applying to Canada? You're getting a better education. It's so much easier to get in here.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of that is that you have to live in Canada, and there are probably quite a few misconceptions about what Canada is actually like.
Yeah, we can say right now that we don't live in igloos. I've never met a polar bear. It is cold. I will say that. Depending on where.
Though.
What's that?
It's quite nice. Yeah.
It is nice. I love Canada. This is my home. This is your home. I couldn't have asked for a better country to live in.
Yeah, just to double click on what you're saying about when you're comparing Canadian schools to US schools, it's difficult to make that comparison like point blank, because you have to consider that there are American schools and then there are American schools, right? And as you were saying, like, it's important to notice that, okay, maybe it's maybe it's harder to get into some law schools in Canada, or easier to get into law schools in Canada than some schools in the US. But if we're looking at those top schools in the US, whole other ballpark. That's how it tends to be with Canadian versus American things in general, right? Think about Canadian sports leagues versus American sports leagues. I don't know why that is. I think Canada's pretty cool. I think we're all pretty cool up here, but yeah, no, it really is a different game.
Sorry, Brandon, didn't mean to go in on you like that. I love that you wrote in. You had some great points here. Did have to take issue with a bit of them, but it's all good fun. It's all about producing as much information as we can, because we know that it's not as transparent in Canada as it is in the United States, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that if Brandon wrote in to Ben and Nathan and he has ever listened to them speak before, he was probably expecting the chance of getting ripped to shreds to a greater degree than what we did. So no, but in all seriousness, Brandon, thanks for the email. And these are great things to be talking about. And if Americans haven't considered, coming up north, it's definitely something to consider. It's not for everybody, but I personally can't recommend it enough.
Exactly. It seems like a no-brainer to me, but that's a different conversation.
Yeah, totally. All right. Yeah. Thanks again, Brandon. And thanks everybody for listening. Email daily@lsatdemon.com if you'd like us to ask us a question or to share some LSAT or law school admissions news. Thanks for listening.